It was 8 o'clock in the morning in Washington, D.C. when Trump, with his trademark energetic gesture, stamped his signature on the executive order that would unleash chaos. It was a 25% tariff on imported Canadian goods, steel, aluminum, and key industrial products, officially justified under the premise of protecting national industry. However, in every newscast and financial outlet, voices of concern echoed, warning of the imminent damage to the relationship with America's closest trading partner. For decades, economic ties with Canada had been a source of stability and prosperity for both nations. But that morning, almost immediately, the first criticisms appeared. Analysts and experts raised the alarm, pointing out that a large percentage of U.S. industrial products depend on Canadian inputs. Some members of Congress, fearing that their districts would be affected by the increased cost of raw materials, rushed to denounce the hastiness of the measure. Reactions north of the border were swift. The Canadian Prime Minister held an urgent press conference where an undercurrent of indignation permeated the atmosphere. Instead of resorting to open confrontation, his speech called for restraint, yet it was clear that his nation would not stand idly by. Canadian economists began discussing mirror tariffs, dollar-for-dollar retaliation, and the looming uncertainty spread like an ominous warning. Meanwhile, at the heart of U.S. industry, executives in automotive manufacturing, appliance production, and infrastructure development were already calculating the impact of having to pay more for Canadian steel and aluminum. Social media lit up with piercing questions. Are we truly protecting ourselves, or are we isolating ourselves from one of our key allies? For many, it was evident that the White House had underestimated the complexity of a highly interdependent economy. And so, it all began. What initially seemed like a political maneuver to bolster national pride ended up lighting the spark of a trade dispute that shook the foundations of decades-long cooperation. The stage was set for a confrontation of unpredictable proportions, and the same question buzzed in every conversation. What would be the real consequences of a trade war between such closely intertwined neighbors? From that moment on, the fate of thousands of jobs, market stability, and the geopolitical balance of North America was at stake. News of the new U.S. tariffs hit Ottawa like a bucket of cold water. Within hours, top Canadian officials convened in Parliament to draw up their plan of action. It was a historic moment. In the face of the White House's decision to impose a 25% tariff on Canadian products, Canada responded with equal resolve, announcing reciprocal tariffs of more than $30 billion on U.S. goods. From fruit juices and cosmetics to essential household items, the list of targeted products was extensive, clearly meant to make an impact on the southern neighbor's economy. Despite the forcefulness of the measure, Canadian authorities maintained that it was strictly a defensive response. "We are not looking to escalate the conflict," declared the Prime Minister, emphasizing that the priority was to shield Canadian industries and workers from the looming economic blow. Yet a quick glance at the serious expressions of Parliament members was enough to understand that there would be no turning back. At the same time, Canadian provinces did not remain idle. Ontario, whose automotive sector heavily depends on interconnected factories and suppliers in the United States, began formulating strategies to ensure the supply of parts and safeguard thousands of jobs. The province's premier addressed the press, pointing out that if tariff pressure did not subside, they would seek out new trading partners and accelerate agreements with other markets, including Europe and Asia. Meanwhile, Quebec, renowned for its aerospace and technology industry, began exploring ways to forge alliances abroad. Its provincial government announced the creation of contingency funds to support affected small and medium-sized businesses, anticipating additional costs and the potential drop in exports to the United States market. Even British Columbia, on Canada's west coast, considered imposing specific levies on United States trucks passing through its territory, aiming to apply direct pressure on the White House and protect its export routes to Asia. The determination shown by each province conveyed a unified message. Canada would not easily yield to tariff attacks. Across the border, affected sectors in the United States started calculating the cost increases for goods that, until then, had flowed relatively freely. Farmers, distributors of basic products, and importers of mass consumer goods began to worry about the possible repercussions for their businesses. Thus, the second chapter of this trade conflict took shape. Far from being a simple clash between two nations, Canada's response made it clear that this tariff war would unfold on multiple fronts, from the federal level down to the independent strategies of individual provinces. And as these two North American powers ventured further into this game of tit-for-tat measures, a growing number of consumers and producers braced themselves to feel, firsthand, the effects of a dispute that threatened to redefine economic relations across the entire continent. Daily life in Alaska, where isolation and vast distances turn every kilometer into a precious resource, is now facing an unprecedented challenge. Imagine the scene. Every morning in cities like Anchorage and Fairbanks, trucks loaded with essential goods line up along the Alaska Highway, a vital artery stretching 2,450 kilometers through the majestic landscapes of British Columbia and the Yukon. This road isn't simply a highway, it's the backbone supplying over 80% of the goods entering Alaska. With the implementation of additional tariffs on U.S. trucks, the cost of transporting these goods is rapidly becoming unsustainable. For decades, truckers enjoyed relatively smooth and economical passage, but now each kilometer traveled carries a dramatically increased financial burden. This doesn't just translate into higher prices at the supermarket, it also endangers critical sectors like construction, healthcare, and tourism, which depend on a steady and reliable supply of materials. The impact is felt immediately. In remote communities where alternative transportation options are limited, uncertainty leads to delays and shortages of essential goods. Picture a family in a small Alaskan village waiting for their shipment of medicine and fresh food, only to discover the additional costs have led to critical delays that jeopardize their well-being. Retailers are forced to raise prices to cover these increased expenses, directly affecting consumers' purchasing power and creating an inflationary spiral that threatens the economic stability of the entire region. But the consequences go far beyond higher prices. Logistics companies find themselves at a crossroads, absorb the extra costs, losing profitability, or pass them on to their customers, risking decreased competitiveness. Some have even considered alternative routes like maritime or air transport, but these solutions are significantly more expensive and far less efficient than the Alaska Highway. Meanwhile, Alaska's government urgently seeks solutions, initiating dialogues with Canadian authorities and exploring measures to ease the impact of this unfolding crisis. Yet, with the broader trade war context and political tensions at play, these negotiations remain complicated and fraught with uncertainty. In short, the additional tariffs on U.S. trucks along the Alaska Highway are triggering a chain reaction that impacts everything from household economics to logistical infrastructure stability in Alaska. Each shipment traveling those critical 2,450 kilometers is now a decisive factor in the well-being of Alaskans, proving that in a region where every resource counts, even a slight disruption in the supply chain can have devastating consequences. Now, the looming question for Alaska is whether it can adapt quickly enough to this harsh new reality, or if eventually, this logistical crisis will evolve into an existential threat for such a unique and challenging territory. When prices in Alaska started to rise dramatically, few imagined the reason would be directly tied to a highway thousands of kilometers away. But that's exactly what happened. The Alaska Highway, a crucial route connecting the state with the rest of the United States through British Columbia and Yukon, suddenly became the epicenter of an unprecedented logistical crisis. Practically overnight, essential goods like fresh meat, vegetables, dairy products, and medications saw alarming price hikes. Items that families once bought without worry suddenly became unaffordable for many. In remote regions where alternatives are extremely limited, the situation quickly became even more critical. Residents in isolated communities rapidly felt the impact. Shortages shifted from a distant possibility into a harsh everyday reality. With each truck crossing the border forced to pay additional tariffs, transportation costs soared, leaving local businesses no choice but to pass those increases directly onto consumers. This wasn't just about high prices, it posed a direct threat to the food and health security of thousands. Clinics and hospitals began struggling to acquire even basic medical supplies, putting essential treatments at risk. Families, particularly those with small children or elderly members, found themselves making difficult decisions about what they could afford and what they would have to leave behind. In major cities like Anchorage and Fairbanks, concern continued to mount. Supermarket shelves emptied more rapidly, and growing uncertainty led some consumers to panic buy, placing even more pressure on an already weakened supply chain. This crisis has made one thing clear: an apparently distant political decision can have real, immediate, and painful consequences. While politicians in Washington and Ottawa continue debating tariffs and retaliations, thousands of Alaskan families are already living the effects of a trade war that threatens to permanently alter their way of life. The remaining question is whether those in power will act swiftly enough, or if Alaska will continue to pay the heaviest price in this economic conflict. The trade conflict between the United States and Canada is nearing a critical turning point. This time, the threat extends beyond economic impacts. It could also affect the energy sources that power millions of homes and businesses every day. Why would this energy crisis be so devastating? The answer lies in America's deep dependence on Canadian oil. Every day, Canada supplies more than 60% of the crude oil imported by the United States, positioning itself as America's largest and most critical energy partner. Yet, in the midst of the trade war sparked by tariffs imposed by the Trump administration, this energy alliance now hangs by a delicate thread. Canada has already begun considering serious economic retaliation measures, and among these is one potential action that could drastically alter the energy landscape of the United States: reducing or even temporarily suspending oil exports. If this occurs, U.S. refineries, many of them specifically designed to process heavy Canadian crude, would face immediate challenges in finding alternative sources of oil, inevitably driving fuel prices to alarming levels. But the threat doesn't stop there. Alaska, despite its own substantial oil reserves, could also experience severe consequences. The state's limited infrastructure and complex logistics restrict its ability to achieve complete self-sufficiency. If Canadian oil supplies diminish, the impact on Alaska would be immediate and severe, rapidly driving up the cost of fuel, heating oil, and electricity. Imagine entire Alaskan communities facing extreme winters with limited or inaccessible heating fuel, or vital industries such as fishing, transportation, and tourism buckling under unsustainable energy costs. Families would witness the price to fill their cars or heat their homes skyrocketing overnight, directly affecting their quality of life and economic stability. This isn't merely an economic issue, it's a potential humanitarian crisis. Alaska and other vulnerable regions cannot afford delayed solutions or prolonged discussions. The reality is clear: if action isn't swiftly taken to ease trade tensions, the looming energy crisis could quickly become a daily emergency for millions of people. The clock is ticking, and the pressing question now becomes: will the United States and Canada be able to set aside their differences in time to prevent this impending energy crisis? Or is Alaska destined to bear the harshest consequences of this unprecedented trade dispute? The trade crisis between the United States and Canada is no longer just a North American issue. Across the Atlantic, the European Union is closely monitoring developments, fully aware that any economic imbalance could trigger a worldwide financial storm. Europe did not hesitate to respond when the United States announced aggressive tariffs against Canada. The European Union quickly expressed its solidarity with the Canadian government, making it clear that it would not tolerate American trade policies that unfairly impact international markets. For Europe, global economic stability is at stake, and this conflict could lead to unexpected consequences for everyone involved. In direct retaliation, the European Union renewed tariffs targeting iconic American products, such as bourbon whiskey, Harley-Davidson motorcycles, and luxury yachts, sending a clear message to Washington. European economic sectors have already begun to feel the anxiety. In Spain, cava producers, whose American market is vital, face potential U.S. tariffs as high as 200%, threatening thousands of jobs and millions of euros in exports. However, not all European leaders agree on the best strategy to confront the United States. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni called for caution, questioning whether retaliating with additional tariffs was truly the best solution, or if it would simply escalate tensions further, leading to a damaging trade war with no winners. Meanwhile, agricultural producers in France, Spain, and Italy are urging their governments to swiftly implement measures that protect their markets and prevent further escalation of the conflict. One thing is clear, this trade dispute has expanded far beyond North American borders. The tariff battle initiated by the Trump administration now threatens international economic stability. Europe has decided that it will not stand by idly while a global crisis unfolds. The world anxiously awaits the next moves, knowing that any misstep could impact millions of lives across the globe.